Great to be here. I run a little thing called the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies. And when we started that 7 years ago now, we had as one of our initial programmatic foci, the idea that we wanted to engage with culture creators, folk culture critics, around the topic of biopolitical tropes, of the different kinds of bioconservative biases and memes and images that we saw in popular culture. We held a conference in San Francisco about 2 years ago about this, a very successful little meeting where we talked about these topics with television folks and movie folks and science fiction authors. So that we've done that. We've had that conversation, and it's an ongoing conversation. We continue to publish articles around those things. We have interns who have done blow-by-blow reviews of Battlestar Galactica and shows like that, trying to parse the way that the memes are playing out in those shows. What I want to talk about today, however, is how I think a number of myths have shaped the transhumanist imagination in ways that are sometimes not helpful, ways that sometimes have introduce cognitive biases into the ways that we approach various kinds of questions. I'm not opposed, I'm a sociologist and someone who's deeply immersed in the kind of mythopoetic richness of human culture, religious, mythological, and storytelling. And I'm not opposed to our being influenced by those myths and those stories. I think we just have to be much more conscious about it. We have to know what the stories are, know that we are being influenced by them, and then we can creatively play with those and channel those kinds of stories in ways that are much more productive. So I put up here, of course, Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces is one of the classic explorations of archetypes that have influenced lots of different stories. But this is a little image riffing on the Ben Gesserit from Dune. And the Ben Gesserit, you may remember, were a thousands of years old group of women who had planted myths and consciously used myths in different societies in order to manipulate societies. Now, I'm not suggesting that we'd be quite as manipulative as the Ben Gesserit, but that is one of the places where that's been suggested. Okay, so what's the first mythology that I think's had a deep influence on the way that we think about things? And it's, of course, the millennial mythos. The mythos that goes back to, it goes back before the Book of Revelations. It goes back to in many different societies that are millennial mythos. But it's the notion that we live in a special time in history, and that there's going to be a global cataclysm of some kind that's going to destroy the existing social order, and that, at least for the elect, there'll be a much better social order coming to take its place, and that this is a turning point, a special point in history. And I think that this mythos has introduced a number of cognitive biases. So these are examples. This is from art about the Book of Revelations, but this is H.G. Wells' Things to Come, which was a very influential kind of utopian story in the 1920s and 30s. I don't know how influential, but it was a popular movie. And H.G. Wells perfectly exemplifies this. There's a world war. He foresaw nuclear weapons. He foresaw the kind of devastation that could come from a global technological war. And then he has the Wings Over the World organization, a technocratic elite, go out and reestablish a world government, a socialist world government. And fortunately, he's not unabashedly utopian, because at the end of the story, there's internal conflict within that world. But they do establish a pretty shiny world before there's that conflict comes. So he's kind of an exemplification of a secular version of this millennialist mythos. Of course, our dealing with questions around the catastrophic risks of artificial intelligence and robotics exemplify this very deeply. This notion that there's going to be a coming cataclysm, there's either going to be an evil God to jump out of the box or a good God to jump out of the box, and we're all going to get either whacked or manna is going to rain from heaven. This very much exemplifies this idea. And these are the four kind of cognitive biases that I've said have come out of millennialism. And I think Ray Kurzweil is representative of two of them. One is over-optimism about outcomes of cataclysmic change, and the other is a certain amount of fatalism, his notion that there is a timeline which can't possibly be changed by anything in human agency, which will lead inevitably in lockstep to a certain point in history when everything changes. Hugo de Garis, for those of you who know his work, he's clearly an exemplification of over-pessimism. He thinks that we're headed for, what does he call it, gigadeaths. Billions of human beings will die inevitably, and for some reason he continues to work on artificial intelligence even so. And then Eliezer, who I think represents Messianism, which I'll elaborate on in a second. The Rapture of the Nerds idea, I'm not dismissing any of our enthusiasms about radical change coming from technology, but there is some truth to this notion of the Rapture of the Nerds, and the one twist here with this particular rapture is that unlike many of the people in the past and other societies who've been attracted to millennial visions, who've often been the downtrodden of their society, in our particular case it happens to be quite a few affluent people who see themselves perhaps as nerds and outcasts in high school, but at least aren't doing too badly nowadays, who think that the coming cataclysm will lift them up and throw down the doubters. So what's the answer to this particular millennial cognitive bias? I think it's to trying to tell stories with more deep history, to recognize that whatever radical changes may be happening in our present time, that the human race is just a flicker, a recent flicker in the history of the universe, the history of this planet. This little clock up here shows if you had the entire history of the planet, came up on the scene in the last minute. And that even if you imagine our future, yes, the events that happen today may determine whether we get to colonize the rest of space, but if we don't do it, probably somebody else is going to do it. So, the things that happen in our particular lives aren't going to be that momentous for the rest of the universe. That's my proposition anyway. And I think the more stories that we hear that put us in that kind of humble position, and I would commend Alistair Reynolds. I think his work is great in terms of writing a deep history for the human race, and also Stephen Baxter's done some wonderful fiction on this. The second myth that I would point to is the Promethean versus Pandoraan myths. The notion that science and technology, reason, human agency is the light bringer, it's an unquestioned good, versus the notion that our curiosity and our intelligence is opening a Pandora's box, which will inevitably lead to the punishments for hubris. And of course, we are on one side of that narrative, and our critics are on the other side of that narrative. But what does it mean for us to be unabashedly Promethean, or as some have accused me, unabashedly Faustian, to welcome the Faustian challenge, the Faustian bargain? You also see this in the work of New Atlantis, this 400 years ago, this basically a science fiction novel about a guy who ends up on an island where science is being used to prolong human life, to improve agriculture, to eliminate toil. It's a very optimistic utopian novel, and the agency is human reason and science. It's still a religious society, but human reason and science. And of course, the counter-narrative of the counter-enlightenment has been this critique of science that has been so influential in critiquing our visions of human enhancement. And so, are we just unabashed Baconians or Faustians or whatever? And I have to put in my obligatory plug against Gattaca here because I think on one hand we do have to take a side in this particular fight because there are so many stupid, terrible Pandoraan visions out there, and Gattaca is used so often in these debates. And basically here I say the story of Gattaca is that it's evil if parents try to have healthier kids. So an entire society is supposed to be evil because one couple decided not to have healthier kids and condemned their son to a lifetime of misery. That the future can fix all kinds of things in kids before they're born, but can't possibly fix this kid's heart once he's born with a broken heart and wants to become an astronaut. That seems like a very unlikely future and very implausible. And finally, that lying to NASA, so you get to go up in a tube with a bunch of other astronauts so that you die in space, which is what apparently happens at the end of the movie, is a valorous thing. instead of a terrible tragedy. So anyway, Gattaca, stupid argument. We have to argue against those kinds of things. We also have to argue against the evil, tragic, repentant, immortalist memes. You know, Gilgamesh, we often refer to him as the first transhumanist story, but at the end, he decides he doesn't need the elixir, and he's just going to build great cities, and that's going to be enough for him. And so he was a quitter. Voldemort, not a quitter, but obviously the evil end of this. And the reason, of course, that immortalism is often portrayed as evil is that you're only supposed to get to immortalism one way through, you know, Jesus Christ or Krishna or whatever. And so we're in a kind of secular struggle here, which I don't think we can escape from. What we need is more visions of upbeat immortality. And I point to these three. Robert Heinlein, which influenced me deeply when I was a kid, his vision of Lazarus Long as this lecherous 2,000-year-old man, the result of a genetic engineering experiment, but clearly someone very happy to have lived a very long life and have used it intelligently. Holy Fire by Bruce Sterling, about someone undergoing a life extension regime and clearly ending up happier as a result and not repenting of it at all. And then Brian Stableford's very under-remarked upon novel called Fountains of Youth, in which the protagonist lives in a future society where everybody has access to extended life, and he decides that because he has access to this, he's going to write a 10-volume series on the future of death, and each volume is going to take him 100 years to write. And the reason I like that novel is those are the kinds of projects that truly life-extended people will engage in. And we need more fiction that says you don't have to just be happy with the 4 square and 12 because you can do everything you possibly want to do in 80 years. No, you can't. You can have bigger projects than that. The third and last meme I'm going to point to this morning is the narrative structure of heroic individualism and how difficult it is for myths and for our storytellers to come up with heroic collectivities, to come up with rich and deep narratives of societies, complex organisms doing things instead of just some one individual heroic person doing it. And of course, this has a quasi-political dimension because the most extreme version of that heroic individualism can be seen in the very influential novel Atlas Shrugged, where there's 10 people who actually create all the wealth in the entire world, and if they decide to go on strike, then we're all screwed, all of us moochers out here. It's not even the 47% versus 53%. It's the the 0.0001%.
No.
And of course, this goes back to also the problem with the great man theory of history. The book of the Passover story, fortunately, it's celebrated by Jews as a story of a people. But really, most people only remember Moses as this guy who did everything. He smit the Egyptians, and he was the one who parted the waters, and he was the one who let everybody out. Instead of being a story about people, it's just the story of this one guy. It leads, I think, in some of our thinking to bolstering messianic solutions, the notion that particular heroes, particular articulators, particular great men, and often in our community, are going to have a greater role in history than they actually will. And I point in specific to the friendly AI idea that I think is deeply shaped by this problem. The friendly AI idea is a messianic, magical thinking solution to a real problem, but a real problem seen through an apocalyptic lens. So the real problem is, what are the potential risks of self-willed artificial life in our world? And the messianic lens says, oh, it's going to be devil out of a box or God out of a box. It's going to be something out of a box. It's going to jump out in 10 seconds. It's going to threaten all of life. Instead of it's going to be slow, it's going to be erosive, it's going to be like rats and mice and lice in the ecosystem. And the friendly AI idea is that what we need is God out of a box to protect us from the God that we are afraid of. So I just say it's deeply inscribed, and what we need is some visions of how we need to engage with the people who are actually doing cybersecurity in the world, because they're not talking about building a God out of a box. They're talking about collective, political, military, economic, nonprofit solutions to build a more resilient cyber infrastructure to actually deal with the problems that might be created by AI. I point also to Edward Bellamy's incredibly influential Looking Backward. Now, it's really awful as fiction, and as politics, it's not that much better. But as a utopian vision, it was incredibly influential at the time, and it inspired hundreds, well, 160, I say here, 160 nationalist clubs. It was nationalists because they wanted to nationalize industry around the US between 1888 and 1892. So this was before the founding of the US Socialist Party, before a lot of socialist ideas were in mainstream currency. This really got the ball rolling in terms of thinking about radical social change. And so these kinds of visions can have a tremendous impact. And finally, I read Kim Stanley Robinson's novel recently, and I was just so blown away. So I just, hats off. Your novel, I think I mentioned it here on the last slide, but I just want to say it's such an amazing story, and you do such an incredible job. So I'm just going to finish my last two slides with a hats off to some of the novelists who I think have gotten a complex vision of our future more or less right in an exciting way. Start with the upper right-hand corner, Babylon 5, which what I loved about Babylon 5, even though the acting was sometimes stilted, was that the conflict ended up with Earth being taken over by a fascist government and an intergalactic alliance of different species have to liberate us from our fascism. Now, how often do you see in science fiction, not only are humans not the good guys who are going in to liberate other people who are fighting, the evil aliens trying to suppress us, but actually an interracial alliance of Democrats are trying to liberate us from our own fascism. That's what I thought was so cool about that. Schismatrix, which actually had the term transhumanism as the binding political element in a post-human polity, a 1,000-year polity in our solar system. Iron Council by China Miéville, which is one of the true evocations of the power of collective action, a kind of a revolutionary community built around a train. Cory Doctorow's For the Win, which is a great novel about people using gaming as a platform to build together Indian and Chinese direct resistance to capitalist depredation. Charlie Strauss's work, which we gave, the Humanity Plus gave an award to, 5 years ago, on the basis of this book, because it's just such an incredible evocation of many different things that could happen in our future. Bryn's Existence, which is just hilarious if you haven't read it. I don't want to give away the central MacGuffin of the story, but it's just such a funny twist on all the memes of science fiction. Battlestar Galactica, which, although there are many things to criticize about it, you can't beat it for the gritty realism of dealing with torture and politics. And in Star Trek, there's no politics. And what happened to all these people? They all got a lobotomy someplace. There's no political argument about anything. It's all racial arguments between the Klingons and the Romulans and everybody else. But within the Federation, no politics. But within Battlestar Galactica, you see a gritty vision of our future. So this is what I'm urging us towards, a meta-mythic storytelling that owns our own being influenced by these different memes, owns that we are on the side of one or another of some of these mimetic conflicts, but then consciously uses these memes instead of just allowing them to subconsciously influence us as cognitive biases. Thank you very much.
I think you have 5 minutes for questions.
Great.
Well, just very quick on another book which may be underappreciated and is very long out of print is Mark Stiegler's David Sling, which is all about using collective intelligence to repel, I think, a third wave of an alien invasion, basically using idea futures markets where people, including an autistic child who's very good at sensing sounds being played by the crew who are actually in the middle of the action. And the whole world is basically, betting on the best strategy, and the team on the spot are using the whole collective intelligence of the planet to repel these much more powerful invaders.
Cool.
David Sling.
Sure about that?
We'll look it up. Yes?
Question for the writers in the audience. So a lot of great myths here, science fiction myths that you've taken us through in no time at all. For someone who wants to do this, who wants to write these myths, the typical way this is done through history is you sit around the fire and you listen to them, or you read the Bhagavad Gita, or that kind of thing. But someone who wants to be a writer and create a myth, How do you think one goes about that? I mean, apart from just the standard, well, sit down and do NaNoWriMo. Any ideas?
I was challenged last night. Is Anna Lee here yet? Anna Lee was rapturous last night about city planning documents as futurist documents, and I began to think about that. Maybe my notion of what storytelling is kind of old-fashioned here. This notion that it's in the novel form or the short story form, or something like that. And maybe we need to create a much more multimedia, complex notion of how one tells stories about the future. So I think many of us would have more access to it, because I know that my narrative, my character development skills are crap, but I might be able to come up with an interesting city plan or something like that.
Sorry, quick correction. Keith, you're right. It's the wrong book. It's Earthweb is what I'm thinking of by Mark Stiegler.
Okay.
Earthweb, thank you.
Cool.
You're welcome.
What's her name?
Earthweb.
Yes, PJ.
Do you think that the issue between collective hero, if you will, versus the individual hero might more be a function of storytelling itself than, I mean, clearly there are collective stories that work, but do you think it might be just more a function of storytelling and the established tropes of storytelling?
I do. I think it has, insofar as it is a cognitive constraint of just the way that we think about things, then perhaps seeing it in the religious context is reflective of that, as opposed to us being influenced by religion. But I do think that, as I began to think about the Passover story, that clearly for the Jewish people, focusing on Jewish empowerment, or the Hebrew empowerment, had been an important part of the meaning of that story. But that for most religious stories, it's about avatars, it's about gods, it's about particular heroic individuals, and not about collectivities. So I think it's had a deep, profound influence, whether it comes from that original cognitive bias.
I would argue it does.
Yeah. Thanks.